So let me just introduce myself. I'm Elise Hendrick. I'm a translator, writer, and YouTube and Twitch creator. And as I understand it, I've been asked here to talk today about the crowdfunded translation project I'm doing of Alexandra Kollontai's Social Basis of the Female Question, социальные основы женского вопроса, beziehungsweise gesellschaftliche Grundlagen der Frauenfrage. And so the way I'm going to structure this is I'm going to just talk briefly about that, give a brief introduction. But what's important to me, since you asked me here, is I want to make sure that I'm actually addressing things that the things that you actually want to hear from me about. So after I do that, I would be very interested in any questions or topics that you want to bring up. So I'm just going to start out with a brief introduction of what exactly the Crowdfunded Translation Project is and why it is a thing that exists. And then I'm going to talk about the translation, specifically the Kollontai translation. So, okay. Now, the background here is I've been a translator of numerous languages since roughly the mid-1990s. And one thing that I have noticed over that time is that a lot of stuff that would be quite important to translate, things that would be of great public interest, that would contribute to public discussion, that would be actually just quite worthwhile to have in a translated edition to make them available to a broader audience, often don't get translated. Because, I mean, when you get down to it, the problem is that the whole model of translation as it exists at the moment is largely a freelancer-based model, where you have individual clients who pay for individual translations to individual translators. And the thing is that a lot of these translations tend to be things that would be quite expensive, and there just isn't somebody with deep pockets who wants to translate them. The result is they simply don't get done, and instead I end up translating things that are quite boring and probably of very little public interest that probably nobody's ever going to read, which is not a great way to spend one's entire career. So I kind of realized over the years that maybe there was a way to sort of short-circuit this, to get around it by actually trying to collectively finance, to crowdfund, the translation of things that would be of public interest and where there weren't any like copyright restrictions or anything like that that might get in the way of publishing a translation, where the idea is that I would work out exactly how much it would cost for me to work on that rather than doing, because it does involve me taking time away from the stuff that is tragically boring, but at least I do get paid for. How much the overall cost would be so that I would be working on that to rather than, servicing my usual clients, and just publicize the crowdfunding in order to try to get that raised from a large number of people. And so I came up with that a few years ago, and it has been sort of going with fits and starts. Like, I managed to get one chapter of a book by Osugi Sakai crowdfunded and translated some years ago. Of course, the trouble is this only works to the extent that you've got, it's all dependent on how much reach you have, and I don't have a whole lot of reach. So, but anyway, so the idea fundamentally is, with these public domains, or at least unrestricted documents, where I can, which can be a book, it can be pretty much anything. I have lots of ideas of things that I would like to crowdfund the translation of. The result of this collective funding effort and my translation of it is a translation in whatever the target language is. I have various. I translate into German, Spanish, and English, as well as occasionally Japanese. German, Spanish, and English are the languages I grew up with, so they're sort of equal for me. Yeah. So the idea is the target language edition is just as available for use, i.e., like republishing or excerpting, serializing, whatever, as the original. It is so essentially because I'm not actually particularly interested in royalties because really, if there were any money behind selling the thing in the first place, somebody else would have already been paid to translate it. So the idea is that my work basically results in something that is as public domain, as gemeinfrei, as the original that I'm working from. So that is basically the idea, and I've been sort of working on that, trying to sort of publicize the model. Let me adjust this camera. My chin keeps on falling out of frame. For a few years now. And now I can move to the current project, which is the Kollontai translation, which I understand is what you're more specifically interested in today. Now, the background there is several years ago, a friend of mine tried to find an English translation of the full book, Социальные основы женского вопроса, Social Basis of the Female Question, 1909, book published in 1909 by Alexandra Kollontai, and could not find it, which was really quite amazing because so much of, there is a huge industry and has been over the past 150 years of Marxist translation. You would expect something like this, a major theoretical work from the early period of this unification of historical and dialectical materialism with the women's struggle in Europe in particular, to get noticed by translators, and yet it hasn't been. So what I'm working on has turned out to be the very first. And she several years ago approached me and said, yeah, can you find an English version of this thing? And I couldn't, and it was huge, and I didn't really see any way that it's 400 pages, it's 90,000 words, it's a lot of time and work to do, including because it was in the form of these bad scans of an old print that would have to be OCR'd and all sorts of things, yeah? So, she basically said, okay, she'll look around. And several years pass, I don't hear anything about this again, and she approaches me again, and she still has not found anything, and it's like, actually, I could probably make this a crowdfunded translation. It seems like there's the interest. It seems like if there had been a previous full-length English edition, it would have been found by now. There are people who very specifically want to read this thing in English. It hadn't, and there had not been an English version that anyone had been able to find. Now, there's a certain awkwardness in being the first. Specifically, that it's very easy for someone to make a liar of you by finding an edition that nobody else has found. And that has been one of the sort of recurring themes throughout this. These people will come up to me because I've been saying ever since I first became clear that this was going to be the first full-length English edition, that, there are people who immediately find editions and it's okay, what about this one? And each time I get very nervous because I've been saying and raising money on the idea that it's the first one, and I look at it and it turns out actually each time it has been an abridged edition that is not listed as an abridged edition. It's every single one. I'm in discussions with a publisher right now. I'm not going to go into detail about that because they are still discussions. If something comes of them, then I will be. But, so my contact at this publisher goes to their board, and one of the board members apparently approaches them, says, we found this edition, what's the deal with this one? This edition that was previously on Amazon is no longer available for sale as an ebook, that I had not been able to find, that none of my friends who have been trying to find this book in English translation had ever found. And I was like, oh shit, okay, have they found the edition that is going to completely screw up the basis for what I'm doing here when I've already 130 pages into it? And it turned out it's only 48 pages long, there's no way. So it was a huge relief, but this has been a recurring theme. Now, I'm going to use this to talk a little bit about what translators actually do, because our profession is very misunderstood. A lot of people think that essentially if you're like going onto Google Trans or looking stuff up in a dictionary or something, that you know, that's the same thing that translators do, and it's not. And usually what translators do tends to be confidential, so we can't really get into really great detail about it. But because everything about this is public, I can actually talk about it in detail to people and explain why that actually isn't what we do. Why actually what we do is a lot more complicated than most of the people, alas, most of the people who are in charge of making procurement decisions for potential clients about how they're going to organize the translations of all their documentation for things like medical devices and things you'd want to get done properly. And don't understand, which is that translation is very much about research. And that has been particularly the case with this book. The thing to understand about this Russian edition from 1909 is that Kollontai is constantly talking about occupations and workplaces that basically nobody has heard of in about 70 years. And it is actually quite difficult to find definitely correct English renderings of these things, even knowing what they are. I mean, because the world of industry has shifted considerably in the past 114 years, and she's talking about the late 19th century, and to some extent about the Middle Ages. And she's using Russian terms, old Russian terms, for these occupations. Like, there was one for some people who make rosaries. Rosenkränze. The rosary makers. And I looked it up, and there was nothing. The only English translation I could find for this term was a plant. There is a plant in Russian that is called the poisonous rosary maker. And I was, okay. Except that the word rosary was not even in the name. It was just an indication of something to do with prayer. Forget what the actual term is. But, so I had to spend an entire day going through trying to find some sort of source where somebody used this term in reference to a person who does a thing rather than a plant that you should not eat. So, yes. So this is the sort of thing that I am constantly doing. For example, there was another term, and this was the research path on this one was so fascinating that I actually did a little mini podcast about it some weeks ago. It's a term for patchworkers, just people who patch stuff up. And now I'm going to have to remind myself what the actual term was, because that will only take a second. I posted about it on Facebook and looked it up that way. It's annoying not remembering the exact terms that I'm talking about. Passings. This will just take a second. Studio. Here we go. Well, okay. I'm not finding it here except in an audio thing, and I'm not going to delay this further. I will drop the link to the audio thing into the chat. so that it can be listened to anyone at their convenience, by anyone at their convenience. But so the thing is about this term that there was absolutely no good in all the standard terminological works that I would usually research these things in. There wasn't a translation that was at all plausible. The only place I could find where it was available, where the term existed in English and Russian and referred to an occupation that fit in with this overall context of textile work, turned out to be a Russian translation of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, where there is an entire, at the beginning of the play, there is an entire series of puns around this particular occupation. And this is the only way I could find a halfway decently attested term for this. This is what translators are a lot of the time doing. Basically, a lot of people think that we're paid to look at the stuff that is actually in the dictionaries. We're paid, the reason we exist is because we are able to find the stuff that nobody's thought to put in the dictionary in the first place, or that the dictionaries get wrong. There's a joke amongst translators that you can usually tell somebody who really is a translator by the fact that if you find a dictionary rendering of something, they will disagree with it, because critiquing dictionaries, critiquing lexicography is a big part of what you do, because you're having to look for terms in their sort of natural environment, corpus-based. We're doing sort of practical corpus-based linguistics, if the term means anything to, if anyone's done any linguistics here. Corpus refers to just texts, natural texts found that have been written in a particular language that are used in order to understand all sorts of things, whether it's like syntax or whether it's usage or any number of other things. But you just sort of look at these huge written bodies of text, and that's kind of what translators are doing. And sometimes we have we have technology that helps us out with that. Like, there are websites like Lingui that are not bad if it's modern. But on the other hand, if it turns out that what you're reading is a Russian translation of Lily Braun's Die Frauenfrage from 1880 something, if I remember, 1880, 1890, where she's talking about the guilds in the Middle Ages in various cities of what I guess at the time would still have been the Holy Roman Empire, then it becomes a lot more complicated, at least until you realize that actually you could find the thing in German, and then it is way easier to find this stuff from German to English than Russian to English. So that has been very much the past several months as I've been working on the introduction, and now most recently chapter 1 of this book by Kollontai, by Alexandra Kollontai, which I should note each chapter is longer than the last. There are a total of 4 chapters if you include the introduction, and the first one, the introduction is 6,800 words. The chapter 1 is 16,000 words. The chapter 2 is 25,000. And then the final chapter, which is, now I have to remind let me get that up. Hang on. I have the cover page, which has the names of the chapters on my Patreon here, and I can look at it and see. And I can just look at it, which is easier than digging up all the individual graphic. Yes, the женщин's политические права, women's struggle for political rights. Chapter 1 is women's struggle for economic independence, which is where we get into where I've had to spend a lot of time looking up medieval occupations that nobody has bothered to put into dictionaries in a very long time, like the rosary makers. Yeah, and then and chapter 2, which is what I'm currently raising funds for, is marriage and the family problem. And the third chapter, the final chapter, which is also the longest chapter, is the struggle for political rights. Now, I should note that that I am by no means a Kollontai expert. I have some vague familiarity with her, but most of what I know about her work, in fact, comes from this book that I'm translating. Practically all of the Kollontai that I've read is this book, and I'm reading it as I translate, so I've only read a little under half of it. So if anyone has questions about Kollontai's overall work, I'm definitely not the person to give them to. I can talk about what has been going on so far in this book and what the overall focus of it has been, but I'm really not the person to talk about her overall contribution to theory. But I can tell you what's been interesting about it, about what I've translated so far, is how much contemporary relevance a lot of things have. Well, I try to go for historical accuracy to the extent possible. Like, I mean, in this, for example, the reason these occupations come up is she is quoting, or at the very least citing, Lily Brown talking about the struggle of women craft workers in the Middle Ages to get access to the guilds and get access to the craft workshops and just be, ja, so vervollgenommen zu werden halt. And so obviously every single thing about that is historically specific. And actually, I mean, in the context of a historical materialist text, it would actually be sort of weird to be not be trying to transpose things terminologically when they're historically specific. You know, it's a historically specific mode of production, and that is kind of everything to historical materialism in that sense. When it comes to expressions as opposed to things like colloquialisms, for example, as opposed to things like terminology about the textile trades and things like that, there I do tend to go with what seems natural contemporarily. I'm not trying to make it read like a period piece, but when it comes to the specifics of what she's talking about, like when it comes to concepts that basically largely do not exist now and were historically specific to the time, then I try to get the accurate term. That she would have been using, that English speakers would have been using at the time. And in fact, when she's quoting contemporary sources, which she does, and she uses the wonderful convention of footnotes that existed before we got systems of citation, where you could just sort of say, "Oh, this was written by Lily Brown sometime." You know, no title, no page number, or something like that. No edition, so you can work it out. You get to go on a magical mystery tour trying to find the quote. And so what I've tried to do in this translation, and if you go on the Patreon, you can find the full text in PDF of the draft translations of the intro and of chapter 1 to see this, is in the footnotes where she's citing somebody, and I can find the full text of the edition she would be working with, and possibly a translated edition as well. I actually add a translator's note where I put that in there, and occasionally I've found that the translation she's relying on, I don't know whether she translated it herself or whether she's looking at a translation somebody else did. Sometimes I found it's inaccurate. Sometimes I found, like, there's a section in Lily Brown's Die Frauenfrage she's citing, talking about the French Revolution and working class women's actually quite timid demands that were made in the context of that. And the translation she uses, without ellipsis, leaves out an entire sentence from the original. So I mention that. So there are those sorts of things I do, which I also, since this is a theoretical work and potentially something that people who are researching Kollontai or researching early material, the early fusion of Marxism and feminism or something like that would be interested in. I want to make it as user-friendly as possible in that regard. So, where I find these full-text editions, and I have to say the Russian National Library is wonderful for this. These old full-text editions that are printings from actually years before, the years immediately before Kollontai wrote this, like pre-1909, are often available in full text as PDFs, just for free without even registering or anything on the Russian National Library website. You could download them. They're actually reasonably good scans even. And so I've been putting that stuff into footnotes so that somebody who is looking at this as a researcher and trying to understand the literature she was relying on can go and just look at it directly. So if they want to see the overall context of what Lily Braun was saying in Die Frauenfrage about the medieval craft workers or something like that, or the French Revolution or whatever, they can actually just go, and I found in that case a Gutenberg Project edition, full text, online, HTML, you can search it and everything. It's, as a translator, it's excellent. I absolutely love them for doing this, because I've had to find names of medieval occupations, and it is so much easier to get those from German than from Russian. And so I was able to just sort of look those up that way. But so that's one thing that I've done there. There are also like terminological things, again, that are historically specific. Like in the sort of darkly comical section at the end of chapter 1, where she's talking about these upper-class Russian feminists trying to organize their own servants. I mean, you can already see where this is going, I would imagine. And she talks about, there's the difference, there's the sort of more progressive wing in what was called the Soyuz Ravnopravnosti, the Equality Alliance is the translation I've gone, who were sort of more vaguely lefty, liberally leaning, and the Zhenskaya Progressivnaya Partia, the Women's Progressive Party, who were just straight up right-wing, very patrician, very like high haute bourgeois, and the solution that the right-wing feminists in Russia in the early 20th century, looking at servants, including female servants, joining this overall working class upheaval that was going on like around 1905, for example, was that their solution to this, in order to organize them, was first to turn them into what in Russian is called приходящие. And that is a very hard term to translate, because there is приходить is a term that has a million translations. And if you look in a modern dictionary, none of them have anything to do with, employment arrangements for domestic servants. None of them have anything to do with that, because it literally just means like auf etwas zugehen, coming towards something. The difference that was being made was not live, the opposite of live in. These were their solution was that these servants were no longer going to live in the homes of the people who were exploiting their labor and paying them basically nothing. They were going to have a servants' cooperative, you see. And the servants' cooperative's only reason for existing, they were very explicit about this, was to ensure that the servants showed up to work. And this was their idea for organizing this was the idea for organizing their servants as part of this struggle. But the thing is, finding a translation for приходящие was not easy, because, again, I mean, and actually, if I were translating this into German, it would be obvious, because it's Zugefrau. You have Zuge, and that's specifically the reason Zuge is in there, is because she doesn't start out in the place where she's working, she leaves there afterwards. But in English, it's more complicated, and fortunately, I have a lot of friends who watch enough Downton Abbey that they knew the term. And it turns out in English it is called a daily, which I never would have come up with, and it has absolutely nothing to do etymologically with приходящие, which is to go towards something, or to come towards something. but I wanted in those cases, especially just to avoid awkwardness in the language, because I want this to be as elegant as her Russian, and her Russian is quite elegant. I didn't want to have some awkward workaround for the opposite, for not live in or something like that. If I could find the right term for that, then I wanted to. And similarly, in order to make sure that I'm doing the terminology for these occupations and workplaces that no longer get mentioned in any dictionary correctly, what I'm doing is actually through this publisher that I'm in touch with and having discussions with, they're going to help put me in contact with people like occupational historians of the time, historians of the textile industry, who can look at my terminology and tell me if I've got it right or what the, correct English term for these things would be. Because the trouble often in translation, and I think this is probably something that non-translators have experienced if they work in more than one language, is that often you know exactly what the thing is. You could give some sort of like circumlocution and say, you give a sort of a definition that kind of skirts around what it is supposed to be, but isn't the term. But you want to actually have the correct term that people use, and if there is one, which sometimes there is not, but in this case there definitely is, because these are occupations that existed existed all over the place in the textile industry. So I know that they must have existed, and often she's specifically referring to them as they existed in France or in Britain or even in the US in some cases, or in Germany or Finland. So I'm sort of indirectly in touch with some people who can probably make sure that I've got that correct. This is why I refer to it as a draft translation, what I've published so far, because the other thing about translating is sometimes you go through an entire document and at the very end, the usage of the term, suddenly, of a term that you've been using throughout, you see some usage of it that shows you that actually you've got it completely wrong and you have to change it. And so I'm going to be going through once I finish the whole thing, which is, that's still a ways off, as I said, there's about 60,000 words to go. Once I finish the whole thing, I'm going to go through it with the knowledge that I have of the rest of the thing, the rest of the work, to make sure that there aren't situations that come up in the next couple of chapters that that turn out to make my translations incorrect and things like that. Occurs to me, my text on my window there is still showing up backwards. So I'm just going to pop this into chat. This is just where you can find me and where you can find the project. And if you want to support the project, which I always very much appreciate, you can also, it's also where you can do that. Oh, wait a second. Hang on. That last one is wrong. For some reason, it cut it off in the middle. Yes. Okay. And I noticed this is... Oh, I'm sorry, somebody's... Well, okay. So far, I have not had to pay for anything. I mean, one thing that one learns as a translator is where all the best free stuff is in terms of terminology resources, and there is tons of stuff out there for this kind of research that you don't even have to register as a member or anything like that. So I have not had to physically go anywhere. There are a number of websites that I rely on sort of primarily, and then the rest of it has been just creative use of Google to find things like this Russian edition of Julius Caesar, of all things, in order to find some usage that actually allows me to do it. I have not actually had to really pay for access to any database. So far, everything that I've used has been freely accessible, if not necessarily easy to find. But yeah, so I have not had to use I haven't had. It's been 0% physically going to libraries, and 100% online. Except to the extent that it's stuff that I just already have in my head. Because with translators, of course, you're getting two kinds of research: the research we have to do for the current project, and the research we did for all the other stuff that we've done up until then that we still remember. And I have an annoyingly good memory for things that I read once or twice at some point, even if I really would rather forget them because they've added absolutely nothing to my life. So it's the combination. So it's all 100% either what's in my head already, or mostly when it comes to these more arcane terms about textile industry and things of that nature, it has primarily been it has overwhelmingly been stuff that I've found online through very creative use of Google, which is complicated by the fact that this is written in the old Russian spelling. Because before 1917, 1918, before the revolution, there were all sorts of letters in the Russian alphabet that were basically pointless. I mean, utterly pointless. One of them, it was just a hard sign, which you don't even pronounce, but it was put at the end of every single word that ends in a consonant, despite the fact that it changed nothing about how you said it. And so, even after OCRing it, cutting and pasting it means I have to go in, and when I do a search, unless I'm specifically trying to find an old version of something, I have to go and fix all of the spellings, because there are all these letters that will simply not show up. Like, there's a letter called yat, which it turns out the only way to actually know how to use that correctly in the old spelling is if you speak Polish. Because there is literally no rhyme or reason to how it was used in Russian as it was pronounced by roughly the 19th century, the 18th, 19th century, because the pronunciation was the exact same as yeah. And so mostly it has been either, my personal knowledge or just creative Googling, essentially, and finding these resources and remembering them. I always have like 5 or 6 windows up because, annoyingly, Windows 10 does not allow you to have multiple tabs with different keyboard layouts. And sometimes I'm needing to search using the Russian keyboard layout, and sometimes I'm using my German keyboard layout, which is just the one I default to because you can use it for multiple languages because it's got accents, so you can do a lot of Spanish and French for the most part if you know the alt code for some of the other letters that aren't included in it. And so I have like 5 or 6 windows, and I'm just always sort of searching there when I'm trying to find something, or when I'm trying to find a specific work that's being cited so that I can put it into the footnotes. It's, but I've not had to actually sort of leave my office for the purpose of this translation yet. And I guess this was meant to be 45 minutes, so I guess I should be wrapping this up a little bit. So, if anyone has any questions, I would love to hear them, because I want to make sure that you got out of this what you hoped to get out of it when you decided to have me here, and thank you for that, by the way. But if you have a chat window available, I've listed all the places that you can find the project, including the translated chapters. That is on my Patreon, which is just patreon.com/Elise Hendrick. And where you can find my obscure, but actually I would say very good YouTube and Twitch streams. The links are in the links are also in the chat, and so. Oh wow, this is something I could talk for another 6 hours on. I have not professionally translated any works of fiction. I do not rule it out. Like, there are 2 Italian authors who have these amazing series that I read that it amazes me. They've been translated into 5 or 6 languages, but not English somehow. They're available in Spanish, German, French, Turkish, and somehow nobody is translating them into English, and it doesn't make any sense to me. So I would be interested in translating fiction. I have not really done it professionally, but of course, when it comes to fiction, when it comes to literature, it really depends. You're not so much just going for like historical accuracy versus general accuracy. You're going, especially, I mean, to some extent, the author's style is always going to be there with you, and you really are trying to make sure that the author is coming through of the original, even if the author is somebody who writes horribly, as it often is in most of the stuff that I translate, which is like patents and things. And often you get authors who actually do not even speak the language that they're writing, and it's absolute nonsense that I spend hours and hours translating. But with fiction, you've got like this entire universe that somebody's created, and you have to really understand exactly how the universe they've created works, even if it is a universe that is realistic, that is like the one that we live in. Sometimes it's something that is completely different, and maybe there are completely different concepts and things like that. And I mean, this is why I say this is something I could easily talk for another 6 hours on, and I still would not really exhaust the topic, because it is, there's just so much going on there. I mean, it is all, in that case, you are very much trying to, what I try to do in all things as a translator is ensure that the person reading my target language translation of a text is, to the extent possible, experiencing something as close as possible to what a native speaking reader of the original reads, what they're experiencing. So essentially, not just that the terms are accurate, but that to the extent possible, the vibe is accurate. And actually, the better the writer, the harder that can often be, because of something. Actually, a screenwriter and translation professor of mine from a very long time ago once said, she referred to the genius of a language. Like, different languages have certain things they kind of specialize in, that they're really good at. For example, the translation I did that sort of led to me talking here included one in the title, Anschlussfähigkeit. Because one of the great things with German is that you could just do that. You could just take a word and slap this suffix on and create this concept, and everybody understands it because it's Anschlussfähigkeit, and you can't do that in English. Even if you like literally translate it, it just sounds weird. It does not fit in with the way English does this sort of thing. The genius of German really is that you can sort of make these kinds of compounds, and you can sort of make them up. You can make them up on the fly. I think we all do, German speakers, make these sorts of, and most of the time people understand them perfectly well, because it's just the way the language works, and English only very conditionally works that same way. So when you're dealing with a really good writer, a lot of the time that's somebody who's really learned to manipulate those sort of specializations of the language they're working with, who really understand the things that the language they're working with are really good at, and can expertly create an experience using those tools, using the sort of instrumentarium that their language is it provides. And as a translator, then you have to somehow turn that into a similar experience in a language that does not have that instrumentarium, that has completely different tools, often, and that is a very complicated thing, especially in fiction, because again, people are, somebody's creating a whole universe for you, and you have to make sure that this translation fits in with that universe. And sometimes, I mean, think about translating something like Ursula Le Guin, or like Madeleine L'Engle, Tolkien, or somebody like that, who creates this, literally just is doing world building very much. And you have to somehow manage to get a translation of concepts that literally do not exist outside of the world of these books, really, even if they sometimes allude to concepts that exist outside of it. and somehow make this a consistent experience for the reader. It's a whole thing. So, I mean, that is the short answer, I suppose, to that question. I would love to do, I would love to do fiction. Actually, I mean, one of the things I would love to do in the context of crowdfunded translation, I mean, it's not just fiction, but the complete works of Kurt Tucholsky, precisely because the writing is so good, it's so relevant. He has fiction in there, and essays and things, and he's just a huge inspiration for me, actually. And he's somebody who would be extremely hard to translate for exactly the reasons I'm saying, because he really sort of mastered that particular toolbox, and half the time he's talking about annoying things about his contemporary German usage. Like the fact that everybody was using aufziehen to refer to every single thing. Or stuff like that, and how you translate that into it would be an interesting challenge. Oh, okay. Well, that's a question I actually get a fair bit, because I haven't actually mentioned how many languages I know. I have 20 working languages, and then there are another 20 that I speak varying degrees of some of. Like my native languages are German, Spanish, English, and then there's a bunch more after that. But what I do a lot of things. Like I'm constantly, I'm watching television in these languages. I try to catch Tatort when I can get my VPN to deceive ARD's website and there's something new. Or, I watch the news, or I watch cookery videos on YouTube in various languages, and I have people I talk to, and there's music, and I'm also often writing, and I have these multilingual streams that I do, where sometimes somebody will pop in and they'll be speaking in Italian or something like that, and then I will talk to them in Italian, or whatever. So I'm just constantly engaging with them all in all sorts of ways. Reading stuff, talking to people, watching and listening to things, and that's basically it. I mean, just sort of constantly engaging with the languages, and there are a lot of them, so it's a whole complicated thing, really. Yeah, this happens to me actually quite a lot, because I'm not necessarily thinking in the language that I'm speaking in, and sometimes I have structured an entire phrase that I'm saying in a way that so far it kind of works in the language that I'm saying it in, but this happens to me in English sometimes. I remember I was talking to somebody, and I got halfway through a paragraph of stuff I was saying, and sometimes people get into, and then the word I was because I was thinking in Bedrängnis geraten. But that's not how you say it in English. That is that entire phrase structure does not work. But I'd stuck myself out that far out of the window linguistically that the only way I could actually fix it so that it would work in English was to think for a second what I meant by bedrängnis and then restructure the entire sentence. And I really kind of didn't feel like doing that because I'd kind of forgotten what I'd already said. But yeah, this is a thing that happens a lot, and I don't mix them that much, except when it's things that are very similar, especially when I've used one a lot more than the other. Like, for example, I speak Dutch and Afrikaans, and those are very similar, and in a lot of ways Afrikaans is a lot easier because you don't have to think about things like what the verb does, or any kind of declinaties, and so. And so when I speak, and I've spoken a lot more Afrikaans than Dutch in recent years. I have novels that I listen to in Afrikaans and everything. So somebody comes up and starts speaking to me in Dutch, in chat or something like that. It is actually da gibt's Umstiegsschwierigkeiten halt. See, that's the thing. I can't do that very easily in English. And so it's very useful that I think most people will understand that those who are listening to it right now. So that is a thing, or a similar thing that happens between Norwegian and Swedish for me. The first Scandinavian language I ever learned was Norwegian. I learned it basically because I wanted to say that I had learned Norwegian. It sounded like a cool thing to be able to say. And then there were just no Norwegians that outside of Norway that I ever ran into. The only Scandinavian speaking people I ever ran into were Swedish. So I started learning Swedish, and that required me to heavily correct my pronunciation, even though the vocabulary was very similar. You know, because Swedish pronounces things the words, the vocabulary is quite similar, but there are entire sounds and entire like phonetic concepts that you have in Swedish, but Norwegian doesn't have. Norwegian is much easier to pronounce out of the Scandinavian languages. Way easier than Danish, way easier than Swedish in different ways. So I had to sort of correct my Norwegian accent that I had when I was speaking Swedish. And then finally I get the opportunity to start speaking Norwegian. Years later, I've only really had a chance Scandinavian-wise to speak Swedish. And I find that I've gone from speaking Swedish with a Norwegian accent to now I actually speak Norwegian with something of a Swedish accent. Everybody understands me because the languages are so similar. The only one anyone has any trouble with is Danish, because the only way you can actually simulate the pronunciation, it's Norwegian spoken with a hot potato in your mouth, but other than that, you know, people will understand you anyway, and I just sort of push through it. Da muss man halt durch. Ja, also, das ist ja auch so eine Sache, da muss man halt durch. Also bei mir ist es halt so, also eins, woran ich mich also beim Erwerb einer neuen Sprache, also einer für mich neuen Sprache halt, immer, also eine der ersten Sachen, die ich mir da aussuche, sind die Möglichkeiten, die Push-Möglichkeiten. Zum Beispiel, wenn man Deutsch spricht, dann weiß man, wenn man sich des Genus einfach nicht entsinnen kann, ja, dann kann man einfach so irgendwie einen nichtssagenden, einen nichtssagenden Anhang halt anhängen. Ja, also zum Beispiel, da ist man sich nicht sicher, also wie man die Mehrzahl von Atlas bildet, ja. Dann sagt man einfach Atlasgruppe oder Atlaspluralität, also das sind schlechte Beispiele, aber man sucht sich einfach die Push-Möglichkeiten aus. Und das ist eine Sache, die ich den Zuschauenden meines Sprachstreams Hyperpolyglot Timothy Lees auch immer näher zu bringen versuche. Dass man ja auch als Muttersprachlerin eben auch diese Probleme hat. Also es gibt ja Fehler, die auch Leuten unterlaufen, die diese Sprachen schon seit der frühesten Kindheit ja benutzen, ne? Und man hat halt Möglichkeit, erstens, also es gibt halt die Fehler, da braucht man sich überhaupt nichts dabei zu denken. Und dann gibt es halt die Möglichkeiten, wie man also denen aus dem Weg geht, indem man halt den Satz ja irgendwie ein bisschen umstrukturiert, damit man zum Beispiel einen unklaren Genus eben nicht am Ende des Wortes hat oder sowas. Insgesamt muss ich sagen, also wenn man eine für sich fremde Sprache jetzt also sprechen will, dann muss man sich halt daran gewöhnen, dass es ja auch Fehler geben wird. Dass man ab und zu mal etwas völlig Verkorkstes sagen wird, ohne es sagen zu wollen. Dass man ab und zu irgendeinen Scheiß bauen wird, sprachlich. Und dass man man muss sich halt dran gewöhnen und bereit sein, das dann irgendwie zu erklären und sagen, ja, also ich dachte, das bedeutet also ganz was anderes, als ich dachte, stelle ich jetzt fest oder sowas. Und das kommt einfach im Leben vor, da muss man halt durch. Kreativ, also ich habe assoziativ gehört und überhaupt nichts anderes. Ja, das ist, also die Sprache ist etwas Schöpferisches. Also, auch wenn man ganz nichts bedeutende Gespräche führt, da gibt es ja dieses schöpferische Moment ab und zu, denn irgendwann mal braucht man ein Wort, das es nicht gibt oder das es so nicht gibt. Und auf einmal hat man ja etwas, also halt ins Leben gerufen, was also es vorher nicht gegeben hat, einfach um einem anderen etwas näher zu bringen, was also im eigenen Kopf irgendwie vor sich geht. Ja, also das ist, also ob man jetzt einfach spricht, also einsprachig, oder ob man übersetzt, also das ist immer was Schöpferisches, finde ich. Also, und das ist ja auch eins der missverstandensten Dinge, die es also in meiner Branche, also als Übersetzerin gibt. Also das Schöpferische an der Sache. Denn man muss ja halt diesen User Experience ja irgendwie, ja, also also von einer sprachlichen Umgebung in eine andere halt übertragen können. Und also das ist unbedingt schöpferisch. Also anders geht es nicht. Also jedenfalls, wenn man es zum ersten Mal macht, wenn man weiß, dass es auf eine Art und Weise geht oder nicht oder eine andere, dann kann man das einfach wiederholen. Aber ab und zu mal kommt es ja, und nicht gerade selten, kommt es ja vor, dass man etwas ja antrifft, was ja noch nie so also experience-mäßig halt übertragen worden ist, und dann muss man eben auch schöpferisch tätig werden. And well, thank you for having me. And the information about where you can find me and where you can find the translation and where you can support the translation, if you are so inclined, you will find in the chat. And also, Jonathan has all that information as well, and I'm sure would also be happy to share it with you if you don't have direct access to the chat right now. So, if were there any other questions? Okay, well, great. I enjoyed this. It's good to talk to you all, and I hope you got something out of it that you were hoping to get out of it. That's why I always have to wonder about that a bit. Ja, also schönen Tag noch, schönen Abend noch eigentlich.